So, welcome everyone to tonight's debate. This House supports the right to die. Thank you all for showing up tonight. So the way this will work is there'll be three speakers on each side giving a 5-minute speech. So the first speaker for tonight's motion, this House supports the right to die, is Gregor. So, Gregor, whenever you're ready, we'll start a timer. Whenever you're ready.
So we're thinking about the right to die. That's a complicated issue and something that can be quite difficult necessarily to deal with because it's death. It's the thing we don't have the answer to. But when it comes to the right to die, we're not just acting about the right to die or euthanasia, because those are very different terms. There's a right to die as in the right to have to actually die, and the right to have the lethal injection. And that, I think, is quite an important point to distinguish between, because if we're arguing about euthanasia, then that can be a lot different to words have lost me at the moment. Can be quite different to the right to die. So if we're talking about the right to die, then I would put forward that a lot of people already support the right to die. I saw from a study in the Pew Research from the Pew Research Center that 79% of Americans already support the right to die. So the right to die is something that, as I said, a lot of people support, and even more people support an idea of a legal euthanasia, like we already have in the Netherlands or Switzerland, for example. And those cases allow people to have a dignified way out, a way that isn't just a right to die as in just the facts, but a right to die in a way that gives them a sense of respect, a way that allows someone to not go through suffering unnecessarily. For example, someone who might be a cancer patient, a terminal cancer patient, they might, as they've got terminal cancer, they're going to die anyway. But if you've got the ability to have euthanasia or the right to die from withdrawal of support, like palliative care, for example, then surely is that not better that someone dies in a way that means they don't suffer, means that they're able to die in a way they want to, rather than what may be cancer or any other disease kind of forces upon them? Would that not really change things? But then again, if you're talking about the right to die, you have to mention assisted suicide, which is different to euthanasia, because assisted suicide is when you give someone the means to commit suicide rather than a lethal injection, which does kill them, but isn't an assisted suicide. But then that's a different argument, because that gives someone some sense of dignity, but it also gives them the methods to commit suicide or to die, which is a different argument entirely. But if you're talking about the idea of dignity, then isn't that also dignified? If someone wants to die, should you not give them the way to do so? The right to die in what way? Should we not argue? Whether that be a lethal injection, whether that be hanging themselves to a tree, as horrible as that might be, someone might want that. And I think I suggested earlier on that this can be quite a difficult topic to talk about, because I said death is the one thing we don't know about. No one can tell us that answer for certain, because everyone who knows the answer is dead. And, well, you can't really ask the dead any questions. It'd be great if we could, but we can't. But I finally must come on to some of my other arguments. Some people believe that people have the right to die because someone like the state shouldn't have interference in whether or not someone can die. It's kind of a libertarian argument that you should be allowed to die because who says the state should tell you whether or not you should be alive? If you want to die, you should die. Why does the government care? And bringing on from that, finally a brutal reality that giving people the right to die can also be beneficial to the country at large, because it can free up space in the NHS, which sounds horrible, but it's a painful fact that allows people really to see it in a kind of medical perspective. If someone is allowed to die, then they don't take up resources. It's just a fact, a horrible fact, but a fact nonetheless. And I will conclude. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gregor, for the opening proposition speech of the night. And now we move on to the opening opposition speech of the night, which is Adam. So when you're ready, we'll start the time for you.
Okay, if you can all hear me.
Yeah.
Well, right. Okay, well, thank you very much. The question of taking one's own life as Gregor has just noted, a very difficult one. It is indeed of considerable philosophical, moral, and ethical difficulty. The theological answer, however, at least as regards to Christianity and many other of the major religions, was always clear. The taking of one's own life was always construed as a harmful act against God's gift, that of life itself. But in more secular societies, such as the one in which we all live, life is viewed less as a gift to be enjoyed, and more of a right or a privilege over which only the holder has control. And thus, with such a viewpoint, we arrive inevitably at difficult questions and complex questions over such things as capital punishment, abortion, and as tonight, the possibility of a right to die. Now, modern views on the right to die concern themselves with a coup de grace to be delivered to those in pain and desperation. It's generally limited to the notion of assisted suicide. I think, however, that this causes so many practical problems with regards to the protection of the vulnerable from circumvention that it is simply too dangerous a policy. But aside from these practical difficulties, there is also a moral argument, which I believe still stands. And to explain this, we can look to some of the earlier Christian theology on this matter. Now, in Dante's La Commedia, when he and Virgil descended into the seventh circle of hell, they encountered the violent. And in the second ring of the seventh circle, they encountered those who had committed violence against themselves, or in other words, had committed suicide. And Dante paints such souls as trees that are withered and dying, and that are only permitted to speak when a branch is broken off and they're in pain. Now, it is a rather bleak and distressing picture, and certainly befitting of the 14th century. And Dante was clearly trying to convey the traditional view of a punishment necessary for those who attempted suicide. Indeed, it was a crime under English law until 1961. Now, I, for one, don't want to advance this view, as I'm sure that many of you will agree with me. It's very outdated. But there is, however, another detail in this metaphor, which points to the moral argument that I hold against suicide, and consequently of the right to die. There is not in the seventh circle of hell a small gathering of withered trees, but rather an entire forest. A forest which ought to be teeming with diverse life and the beauty of nature, but is instead filled with dried up roots and leafless branches. The violence committed against the self has turned a forest into completely inhabitable and infertile space. The message here is that once you take but one life in this manner, you inevitably risk setting in motion the loss of yet more life. From a merely practical point of view, I think there is a genuine and serious danger of placing, to a greater or lesser extent, societal pressure on persons who go on living with severe disabilities or chronic illnesses or such like, where others with these conditions are seen to commit suicide or to be aided in doing so. But I would go further still and argue that the act of suicide or assisted suicide renders all life incapable of meaning. In other words, the right to die cannot coexist with the right to life, because the minute you accept that a mere mortal has the godlike ability to determine that his own life can no longer be worth living, then a judgment is cast on all those who go on living in that state that others had considered unlivable. I believe that all life is of equal value, regardless of the resources that they take up. We should not allow anyone to even contemplate the possibility that death should be preferred in any set of circumstances. Morally speaking, therefore, it is wrong to allow for a right to die that could lead to a spate of suicides, and which is inconsistent with the right to life, which I'm sure none of the proposition speakers would seek to disregard or otherwise set aside. Simply put, having a right to die is a step too far. I fully sympathise with those people who find themselves in the position where they contemplate asking their loved ones to relieve their pain and to help them to pass away peacefully and hopefully pain-free. But I believe that it's necessary to forego these inequities in order to protect something more valuable and important than even dignity in death, an unalienable, necessary, and fundamental right, not the right to die, but the right to live. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opening opposition speech of the night, Adam. And now we move back to proposition, a speech from Magnus. So we'll start 5 minute time whenever you're ready.
All right, perfect. Regardless of whichever of the innumerable possible shapes our human lives may take, given that we are 7 billion people, at the end of the day, we all finish in the same way, in the same position, the end of life, death. The one thing that we can all hope for, regardless of what we have done, have not done, have fulfilled and not fulfilled, is at the very least a good death, a dignified death. At the very least, we should hope that in our final moments, that they are spent in comfort, lack of anguish, and at the very least, with dignity. The world we live in generally, especially here in the West, is very death-phobic. We don't really discuss it with our friends and our families. We don't really give it much thought in our brains. Seeing reminders of death, reminders of mortality is seen as very taboo, very uncomfortable outside of the relevant industries. And most people shy away from discussing it in any great detail because it's so violently uncomfortable for us, for understandable reasons. But as a result, death denial, specifically when it comes to this discussion, severely hampers our possible discussion on the matter. When it comes to the discussion of the right to die, nobody obviously chooses to die frivolously. Nobody chooses to die simply because, okay, sorry, let me rephrase that. Death is not a decision that one takes lightly. It is something that no one ever takes lightly. And when it comes to the subject, it is very important to say that there's a very sorry, my train of thought was lost. It is very important to put up a distinction between the right to die and simply suicidal ideation. It is not simply someone who, in the throes of mental health crisis, chooses to want to kill themselves. It is not what we are discussing today. People who want the right to die are not those who are in this temporary or possibly temporary states. It is someone who, for example, with a terminal disease, who's already in a lot of pain, whose condition will only get worse and worse and worse before the life finally ends. It is someone who, in the autumn season of their life, has just been diagnosed with Alzheimer's or another form of dementia or another form, or perhaps even with cancer, and wants to end their life while they still have their senses about them and the ability to treasure their life while they can still remember it at the very least. The right to die is only established in a few places around the world, including the US state of Oregon. Statistics from there have said that of those who choose to make use of that act to put their life to end prematurely, the vast majority have said, over 90% have said that the reasons for doing so is decreasing ability to participate in activities that make life enjoyable, 96.2%, loss of autonomy, 92.4%, and loss of dignity, 75.4%. And dignity, the right to die with dignity, is the single most important thing to keep in mind. Because these people are not those who are in the throes of mental health crisis, as mentioned previously. These are people who truly, fully, and completely, very literally, have no options left, who want to assure that at the end of their life, they want to at the very least die without pain and with dignity. As mentioned by Adam, the previous speaker in opposition, the religious view of life is that it is the greatest gift of all given by God. And the secular view is that everyone has an inalienable right to life over whom only we have control. I agree with both of these views, as both a religious person and a kind of secular person. However, as great as life is, it is only as good as our ability to fully live it, so to say, physically and mentally. And for those in the autumn season of their life, for those who struggle with terminal diseases, as much as they want a good life, they also want a good death. And for those people, if they want to enjoy the rest of their life, what they have left, they want a good death. Whatever. Yeah, that's me. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Magnus. Go on to the opposition speaker again, which is Robert. So, Robert, when you're ready, we'll start your time.
Okay, yeah. So I think that a lot of what Magnus said was very, very good and very indeed true. But he did specifically exclude a group of people who I think we need to talk about, and those are people with mental illnesses and suicidal ideation, right? And this is important because when you have a right, when you have a fundamental right, it has to be applied universally, right? You cannot have a case in which someone forfeits their right to life, really. You cannot have a case in which someone forfeits like a right to the basic necessities of survival. And if you were going to say something against that, like in the case of like killing in self-defense, that is one person's right to life taking precedent over another person's right to life. That is not a forfeiture of right to life. That is a balance of those two rights, right? And so we think that if you do have a situation where you give a right to death, it has to be a right to death to everyone. And that means that it would have to also apply to people in the aforementioned categories of having mental illnesses and suicidal ideation, right? And we think, of course, this is not what we should be doing there, because when you have, there are many reasons to feel like it is worth ending your life, but in those cases, we think that those reasons are not true. They are not the case. We think that when you have depression serious enough to lead to suicidal thoughts, that is that is the brain making a perversion of reality to try and twist you into thinking that you have this, and it is not in fact the case that you have these things. And we know this because this can be changed, right? You can go through enough therapy, enough help, you can get medication that will help with these issues. I'll take the point of information from Magnus, yes.
I certainly agree with that when it comes to like mental health, that is definitely very distinct. But when it comes to like those with terminal diseases for whom the right to die applies, at least in my case, you know, these cases are followed up with like thorough like medical evaluations and like that gets stretched over years or months. What do you think about that then? Like, how does that not distinguish itself from that?
Well, I think that by giving out, like, I agree that maybe in that case it is justified, but I think it is more important that by giving out a right to life in general, we would also give it to people who have, who would end their lives unnecessarily, people who could be helped, people who could go seek professional help and who could have their lives turned around and who could in fact go on to live a better life. And so, and yeah, and I think that's the fundamental part of what it would mean to be a right. For it to be a right, it would have to be applied to everyone. So otherwise it would be a privilege, really. That would be the terminology for it. So because I feel that we cannot sanction the taking of life when it is not absolutely necessary, when it is not based on rational foundations, when it is taken under the influence of an illness or a disease, I have to oppose this motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that speech, Robert. Now we move back again for the final time to proposition to the motion with Zach. So, Zach, whenever you're ready, we'll start the 5-minute timer for you.
Okay. The first thing I want to address is, as far as I'm concerned, the right to die and euthanasia to me, it's not a political issue, it's an ethical issue, right? I understand there are practical implications, everything, but if we look at the ethics of it, that should come first. Now, some of you may be familiar with what I'm going to say, so I apologise if you already heard this, but all ethics are trying to derive what sort of things are right, what sort of things are wrong, right? And they do that by allocating good and bad. And all ethics come from what's called meta-ethics. So that's the idea that not what things are good, but what is good fundamentally. What is it essentially? And there's four main theories of meta-ethics. There's called naturalism, where we observe what is good from the environment around us. So if I were to go onto King Street and punch someone, you could see the suffering that would cause. You can tell that is bad, that is not good. There's what's called intuitionism, which is the idea that we just know inherently what's good. We can feel it in like a conscience. There's divine command theory, which is what... Yeah. Now it's on Union Street, not King Street. There's divine command theory in that we know what is good from God. And God tells us God is good in himself. I think that was what Adam was slightly getting on about. And then there's nihilism, the idea that there is no such thing as right and wrong. And these implication of these meta-ethics comes into everything. You know, if you're talking about any form of politics, any form of sociology, Scientology, it boils down to this, because without knowing what is right and wrong, what is good, essentially, you can't do anything in society. Now, with regard to euthanasia, if we're looking at the implications of it, you know, we could apply each one of these four values. Nihilism obviously says there's nothing wrong with euthanasia because there's nothing wrong with anything. Divine command theory, as Adam pointed out, shows that there is something wrong with euthanasia because God says it isn't, and God is what is good in himself. And then if we look at intuitionism, that is completely subjective. It differs on what you feel inside. So one intuitionist may say, I can feel in my conscience that euthanasia is wrong, and then another might say, no, it's absolutely fine. I can see the suffering that man is in, and he should have the right to die. And then we apply naturalism lastly. Naturalism would agree with euthanasia in the general. The only trouble with naturalism as such is there's so many, any physicists out there will know about chaos theory, the butterfly effect. There's so many implications of everything. You can't, you know, if I might punch someone on Union Street and then that stopped World War III for whatever reason. You know, you in that case, naturalism say, oh yes, that's a good thing to do then, but you can't analyze all these things. Now, the reason I'm talking about all this is those four different theories, none of them are, it's so subjective, none of them are true, none of them are proven. And I said earlier about the importance of meta-ethics, how crucial these sort of thinking is to everything. You can assume and just say, oh, well, we have to say pick one of these to the society and politics to work. But none of those four are inherently correct. They're all subjective. Philosophers argue about them a lot. Someone like Immanuel Kant, who was an intuitionist. Someone like Dante, who wrote the Divine Comedy, as Adam said, was a naturalist. And in the case that everyone argues about these things, you can't have a definitive answer. For that reason, if you were to say that person shouldn't be able to die, I would disagree. I'd say essentially you don't know that. I mean, yeah, you could spin that around at me and say you don't know they can die, but until you have a definite answer, you shouldn't interfere with other people. Do it yourself by all means. And I agree that there is another person involved in euthanasia because obviously you need someone else required for any form of euthanasia. If those two people are both complicit in their same set of ethics, then I don't see a reason to interfere. They're both consenting. Those are all the agents involved. Other things, there may be different agents involved. So then at that point, you would have to interject. But because we don't have any sort of definitive answer of what is good, what is not good, and I know this applies to literally everything in life. That's why it's such an important issue, and people have been debating it for years, centuries even. You should not be able to interfere. And if someone is in a state of dying, and let's say person A is in a very a state where they're extremely ill and they want to die, and person B says, I'll help you, I'll let you die. If I were to then go, no, you can't do that because I believe in intuitionism and you are wrong, A and B might say, you can't prove that, you can't show that's real, you can believe that, fine, but until you can believe it, respect our liberty between us as consenting individuals to do this, and just completely butt out, essentially. So argument is you cannot for definite say that euthanasia is wrong, and because it doesn't involve you and it involves two other completely different individuals, then you should not have an input on that without proof of your ideals. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Zach, for concluding the side of proposition. And now we move on to the final speech of the floor of the table tonight, which is Jack on the side of opposition to round up the debate. This House supports the right to die. So Jack, whenever you're ready, we'll start 5-minute timer.
Okay, so I think that when we what we need to talk about in terms of like points of clash is kind of like I think kind of like the kind of like legal or practical stuff, and also looking at in terms of like morals and ethics. Now, these so in terms of like legal so in terms of like legal and practical stuff it can be quite hard to like create any kind of like kind of legislation regarding right to die that would, and making sure that that's kind of like proof from various kind of like nefarious influences. So a good example of that would be, so say for example, I think it was so say for example someone's in a vegetative state and like they've technically like say signed something that says I want to die, but we're not sure whether or not they were of sound body or mind when they said that. We don't, and then it comes down to like say for example that's open to say nefarious influences, like say the immediate family of that person potentially wanting to quicken up when they receive an inheritance or something like that, and that's when. Secondly, I think that when secondly, again, I think that you need to look at making sure that like whatever if you need making sure that again if you're going to be doing this sort of stuff in terms of rights right to die, you also need to make sure that again that say if some that like that whoever is wanting to die has to be able to be of like say sound mind to be able to say that they want to die, and then that goes into a whole debate about like what constitutes sound mind, what does not constitute sound mind. I think that secondly, I think I want to go into kind of moral stuff. So I think that when it comes down to it, I am gonna go all religious here and talk about like what kind of like what ability, like why do humans have the ability, like why is it that humans want the ability to kind of like interfere with their own lives? Obviously I think that when you sorry, again, I was originally meant to be on the other side and trying to think on my feet. I think that when it comes down to it, you need to be talking. I think that when it comes down to it, it depends on like kind of like every single circumstance under the sun, and that's when things get a little bit dodgy in terms of like when whether or not you want like implementing like universal policy. So kind of like making sure that when you do pass something to do with rights, making sure that it looks like something that can be that can address all of these concerns. And secondly, I do think that if, for example, in terms of like God and religion, there is I think the idea that like say the state having the power potentially to end someone's life can then go into slightly dodgy territory. For example, say we've already had controversy over, I think it was like a care pathway that Liverpool City Council put in place about 10 years ago that was about kind of like gradually moving, about the gradual switching off of life support machines without someone's consent. And I think that was when it and those sorts of things need to need to be addressed. You need to make sure that whatever, like if you do implement a right to die, you need to make sure that it is in some way robust enough that that it doesn't involve the state having an innate ability to take away the lives of its subjects. That's something that it's something that was fought for when we in terms of like the abolition of the death penalty back in the mid-60s, and I think it comes to and that's definitely something that we need to be looking at. Sorry, thank you. Please oppose. Sorry, I'm ill and tired and everything. Sorry for the awful speech.
No worries, Jack. Thank you very much for finishing up the table debate. And now we move on to the vote for tonight. This is done by messaging the side chat or raising your hand when I say the proposition and the proposition. And if you're an abstention for the motion, don't say anything at all. So we'll start with the vote for proposition. If all those in favour of this House supports the right to die, raise your hand now or message the side chat. So we go.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay.
Yeah.
And all those in opposition to the motion, so this House does not support the right to die, please raise your hand.
1, 2, 3. No, it's the 4.
That's 4. So with 4 to 3, this motion passes. This House does support the right to die. Thank you all very much for coming along this evening. And I'll hand you on to Gavin, who is our weekly officer, to show next week's motion. This will be next Thursday.
Thank you very much. Let me just share quickly. And this is next week's motion, and that is this House would support Universal Basic Income, or UBI. And that's this House would support Universal Basic Income. If you want to speak, please give me a message, give one of the council members a message, or give the Aberdeen Debater Facebook page a message, and we can sort you accordingly into either proposition or opposition. But bound to be a pretty lively and very current debate. So certainly something that you should all be interested in. If you've come along to this, then please consider coming along next week. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much for that, Gavin. So yes, next week's motion, this House would support universal basic income. It is 7 p.m. next Thursday. Hope to see you all there. Until then, we have trainings on a Tuesday and a Thursday before the events on Thursdays. Until then, thank you very much and good night.
Good night.